a few weeks of lectures and that. But as I always do, I take an angle, or what interests me. What is it that has grabbed my attention over the years? And I wouldn't mind to answer any questions or what things that you might have on your mind regarding the history. Now, next week it's going to be the teaching Mass. I'm going to go through the Mass and go through the parts of it and tell you something about it that might connect to your own experience of the Mass, so you can relate to it even better. There's a lot to the Mass, of course. So regarding the church building of St. Joseph, what I'd like to do is do a little context. So the context that I find fascinating is that when Catholics came into Kentucky, which was 1774, so before the Declaration of Independence, 2 years before that, there were immigrants that were coming, pioneers coming across the mountains and scouting out this land, because once the French and Indian War had ended, the French and the Indians lost and the British won. So this area was contested by the French and the British. Well, once the French were out of the way and it was just the British, then the colonists felt like we now can go across the mountain and get land and get new land, because our land is wearing out over here on that side of the mountain. And so they start coming across. Well, the British didn't like that. They're a little bit afraid, I think, of the growing colonists, all that kind of stuff. And the Indians, they didn't like it either. But these pioneers, come on in.
Sorry.
That's right. And that's Angela, my sister.
Sorry to interrupt.
There you go. So as the pioneers began to come over, land speculating and all that kind of stuff, surveying and all that kind of stuff, along came some Catholics. One of the two earliest Catholics was Dr. George Hart and Jane Coombs, Coomes. They are two of the earliest ones. They came to Harrodsburg. They were there in 1774. And then ultimately they came to Bardstown. And Dr. Hart had a big piece of property that he claimed up north of the city, which is about 1 mile, which is where our Catholic cemetery is. By the way, he gave 2.3 acres to the church ultimately, to Father Baden in 1803, before we were ever a diocese. Now, before 1803, back about 8 years earlier, 1795, we think that they built a log church up on that property. And there they had Mass. They at least had funerals. But we think they had Masses because before that, before 1795, they had Mass at people's homes, like the early church did.
Yes.
The earliest church had home. You didn't have church buildings. In fact, it was illegal to have church buildings in the earliest years. The church wasn't recognized as a valid religion. So they would gather in homes, particularly richer people's homes, because they were bigger and could accommodate. So George Hart was one of the people in Quinn, up north of this, where Nazareth is. He had a house, and they had Mass up there. So the priest, Father Baden, and the other priests would go from house to house to house. The Howards down here at St. Thomas, they'd have Mass there, see, and people would gather. Now, I don't know what it's like to have people gathering in your home for Mass, especially as population gets bigger and bigger. Well, they can't fit in the house, and out the windows and out the door, whatever. And like, we got to build something. And first of all, do you want everybody coming through your house for Mass? And what leaves after Mass that should have stayed? I don't know. Maybe nothing. But eventually, Dr. Hart had a cabin built up on that property where the cemetery is. And that's where St. Joseph, the Catholics here, gathered there for Mass. And of course, we were starting to bury people because people do die in pioneer days. Where are you going to bury them? Well, we know that the Protestants or the other people behind the jail, because I imagine a few people died there too. But John Fitch, there's a cemetery there. Well, why? Because you got to bury people. Where are you going to bury them? Well, bury them there. The Presbyterians buried them at the end of 5th Street at Templin. That's a Presbyterian cemetery. Well, the Catholics got buried up a mile north of the city where the cemetery is now, at 2.3 acres. And ultimately, since that was happening, eventually he said, well, I'm just going to donate that land to the church, to Stephen Batten, who ultimately turned it over to Bishop Flagey when he came. Isn't that interesting? So the gathering of people, like I said, Bishop Flagey, when he came, he went first to Loretto. That's where Father Stephen Batten was. He went there, was welcomed by the priest that was here in 1811. So that's where he first went. And then, of course, he's doing the circuit riding with different things. And the Howards up here said, you can have Mass here. And in fact, Mr. Howard died and willed that property to the church, to the bishop. So he came up here, started the seminary, started building the church of St. Thomas, 1812 to 1816, 1813. They built the brick church. And of course they used you have the architectural drawings for that church came from Baltimore. Because there were no architects around here. So they brought the drawings from Baltimore. Well, where did those drawings come from? Well, that was the drawings that the seminary chapel was built from, which is a third of the size of the French church. That's the original drawings. So they brought it over here. They said, well, we can't build that big, so it'll be a third as big as the one in France. That's the chapel at Paca Street in Baltimore. Well, when Flagey came here, he took the drawings and said, well, we can't have it as big as that chapel. We'll build it a third less, so it's 1/9 the size of the French church. And it took 3 years. So, those niches out front, they didn't, as you make it smaller, they don't have room for all the statues that are supposed to go in like the original church. So they had to squeeze it down a little bit. And they don't have as many niches as the original, because well, once they finished that church, the bishop said, I need to build a cathedral so that's 1816. He started building here, got this lot up here. Now, why would he choose this spot for our church? My church, your church. Why would he pick there? Why didn't he go to Springfield? Why didn't he go to Lexington? Why didn't he go to Hodgensville? Why didn't he go to Louisville? Well, there's a reason.
Because it was close to where they were having Mass and where our cemetery is now.
Well, that was one of the reasons, but the main reason is the crossroads. You want your cathedral to where people can get to it.
Easily.
Right. And the overland route from Lexington to St. Louis goes right out there in front of our church. And the road that goes from Louisville or north down to Nashville, Tennessee is right down in front of our church. So the north, south, east, west, and so he wanted it where it was accessible. This is the place. Now, why wouldn't he build his cathedral out there on that land that he already owned at St. Thomas? Well, there's a problem. There's a river. It's called the Beach Fork River. You got to be careful. There's no bridges. How are you going to get there safely? Better be on this side of the river. up the hill where the crossroads are. Most of the people will have access here rather than on that side of the river. So that's why the church was this space was chosen. It was outside of town. This was outside of town. It was one of the outlots. I think actually the houses across Fifth Street were these were outlots of the last houses of this town of Bardstown. So we were outside the town. A little cheaper. The farm, St. Joe Prep had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, right? And, just like St. Mary's Seminary, they had a farm. You had hogs, you had cattle, gardens. How are you going to feed the students? Better raise your chickens and your hogs and your cows. That's how you feed students and people. So there was a farm back here where the city hall is and Spalding Hall. That was all farmland. And so that belonged to the St. Joseph College. So anyway, this was why it was chosen to be put here, so it's called the Crossroads. Now in 1841, which is 21 years later, it became very evident that this was not the center of the population, that there were lots and lots and lots and lots of people coming down the Ohio River and settling in Louisville. So they did not, why didn't they think about that? Why didn't they anticipate that? Well, couple reasons. One is there was still an Indian threat until after the War of 1812. And that the Indians in Ohio, Indiana, all that were still a threat to the population. The second reason is that the swampland, Louisville was swamp. There was yellow fever. The Indians did not camp in Louisville because of yellow fever and all of that. The diseases, the mosquito-borne yellow stuff, all right? And so Louisville was not inhabitable very much. But of course, as the Native Americans were moved on to the plains, it became safer populations. Cincinnati boomed. And then now Louisville. And the bishop said, I need to be where the majority of the people are. I need to be closer to the people. So he moved the cathedral from here. So it became the Diocese of Louisville then versus the Diocese of Bardstown. By the way, the original Diocese of Bardstown became 44 different dioceses. So in a certain sense, it kind of lost its identity because it kept taking off apart, taking off apart, taking off apart. Indianapolis, Chicago, Nashville, all of that. So the Diocese of Bardstown had been, whittled away, and by taking it to Louisville, it became the Diocese of Louisville. And so the cathedra, the chair was moved, and it was no longer a cathedral because the chair was gone. It's up in Louisville, the bishop's chair, the teaching role of the bishop. Now, this became what they call in 1997, the proto-cathedral. Recognized that, this was the original cathedral for the Diocese of Bardstown, the suppressed Diocese of Bardstown. Now, the church throughout the world has always recognized that certain dioceses existed and had a very important role, but then population shifted and all that kind of stuff, and that diocese no longer was centered there, it was centered somewhere else. But to honor that diocese, they kept the honor of its role in history. So it was called a titular diocese. So it had the title, but it wasn't canonical. So the canonical juridical responsibility would be with Louisville now, but it still had the title of Bardstown. And this was the proto-cathedral of that. And so we have a titular bishop who is an auxiliary bishop somewhere. Ours is in Brooklyn, New York right now. He has the honor of being the Bishop of Bardstown, but it's not canonical because the diocese is Louisville. Okay? So, let's see. It took 3 years to build the basic church. Now, the church did not have a front porch on it, did not have the steeple. You know, when you build something, you don't always build as big as, people add on to their houses. People add on a garage. People add on a building here and improvement. Put a swimming pool in. The house is not the way it originally was because they couldn't afford it. They built on. Well, this church was built on. So the front porch wasn't there. It was about 1824, I think. About 5 years later, they got to build the front porch. In fact, they lost the cornerstone. Father Howard, who was here in the 80s, found that cornerstone. They were repairing something on the front porch. They said, there's got to be a cornerstone here somewhere. And it's usually on the corner. But the corner was covered up by the front porch. Well, he dug down there, and daggone, there it is, the original. So he excavated that, put a glass piece over it. Now you can go over and look. There's the cornerstone, the original cornerstone. But that building did not have that front porch on with the columns and the steeple originally. It was the brick facade is the original. And then, of course, the sacristies have been added on. It didn't go around the back. You can go over there and you can just see the stones at the foundation. The original stonework, you can see where new stone, which are smaller, are built on. So that sacristy was extended around. And by the way, the east sacristy did not connect to the rectory now. There was a walkway. There was a door and sky, and then a door into the old sacristy, which is where one of those windows are now. Well, why was, so first of all, when they built the college, that was the college, St. Joseph College. It wasn't a rectory, it was a college. And there they had classrooms and a refectory and for the seminarians and the college students, St. Joseph College. Well, why didn't they have them connected? Well, because you have fireplaces. You have fireplaces, 4 of them over there in that building. You know what happens with fireplaces and flues? Fires happen. You don't want that building to burn and burn the cathedral. So this is just like kitchens. A lot of the early houses had separate kitchens. So if the kitchen catches on fire, it doesn't burn up the whole house. And then they begin to connect them with breezeways and stuff like that when it got safer. But that's why. That's why it wasn't connected, to protect. And the rector of the college was the pastor of the parish, Bishop David. Father David was the first rector of the cathedral, and he was the president of the college. There were at least 4 rooms for priests on the 2nd floor, which is where I live, and the associate and guest room. The 1st floor was 2 classrooms, refectory, and dining room, kitchen. And then the 3rd floor, which actually has a solid roof now, it did have dormers. If you see old pictures, there were 7 rooms and 7 rooms. 14 rooms on the third floor. You go up those little steps and you can see where 13 little cubicles were, little cells. And that's where the seminarians lived. Now, the day students lived in their homes and traveled and had classes because they couldn't afford just to have a seminarian. They didn't have enough seminarians to teach. If they're going to teach, might as well teach a bunch of boys, as many as will come. So they had day students, and then when they built Spalding Hall, they started having boarders People come from New Orleans. 50 students one year came from New Orleans. Catholic students up the river and go to school here. Not all of them were Catholic. The day students joined. That's the starting of St. Joseph College. St. Joe ultimately became St. Joe Prep. Okay? Now, the church, the Tavern, I think this is fascinating. Because it's a crossroads, you got to have a place to have a libation. Mighty thirsty. And there has to be a stable for the horses to rest and change your horses and the stagecoach and all that. And so that was built 1779. And a couple years before that, there was a little village here called Salem. If you're going to live somewhere, you want to live in a town of peace, not the Wild West. So they called it Salem. Shalom, peace. Jerusalem, the city of peace. The Jebusites named it that. Yeah. Melchizedek was the priest and king of Salem before it became Jerusalem, city of peace. It was called Peace. Now that little village, which had the swimming pool down there and the mill and all that kind of stuff, ultimately that was suppressed when the town was incorporated and became Bardstown. So it lost its name. But that Tavern was part of this early location because of the crossroads. I just think that's so fascinating. Once they built this, they built it of all the local stuff. We have limestone, it's got limestone. We have clay, we make bricks, got bricks. It's got poplar trees, we got poplar trees. We got oak, it's made out of oak. So the wood, the bricks, and the foundation, all is local. And people built it. What it doesn't have glass. They had to bring that in. They had clear glass or even milk glass. They had to put curtains up there because it was so bright that you couldn't, became sometimes too bright. So they had to close the curtains, Well, ultimately, these stained glass windows were put in there, and they're dark glass. You wonder, why are they dark? Well, you know and I know that when that sun's coming in, sometimes even through that dark glass, it can be blinding, But you say they didn't have stained glass back in those days. They had milk glass or even clear glass that had to be brought in. Artwork. How are you going to decorate a cathedral? Well, we don't have tabernacles. We don't have vestments. We don't have paintings. We don't have candelabra. That's all over in Europe. So the priests and the bishops here would go back. Whenever they did go back, they begged for the missions to get decorations to make it like what they came from and make it beautiful. And there were generous donors. The King of Belgium, I think, gave the tabernacle. The kings of the Sicilies and France gave the paintings, and then vestments were donated and stuff like that, candelabra and everything. Very interesting how it was, And then, so this church, what's really amazing, a couple things amazing, and that is, number one, Catholicism, there was not religious freedom in our nation, in the colonies. In the north, Massachusetts, it was the Puritans. The Anglicans were not welcome. The Methodists were not welcome. The Catholics were not welcome, for sure. They were papists. So Catholics couldn't build churches or schools in colonial, even in Maryland, which was set up as a place of toleration, became intolerant because the Puritans began to outnumber the Catholics. So the Catholics couldn't run for public office. They couldn't build churches or schools or anything like that. Not until the American Revolution was their religious freedom promoted. So that whole idea of freedom, freedom from European oppression, freedom from the religious wars, the 100 Years' War, all focused around religious issues, you know? And so this idea, we want to be free. We want to have freedom that we can choose our government, we can choose our religion, we can choose whatever. And, in Maryland, for example, the Catholics were taxed. They had a church tax because the church supported the religion. Didn't support the priest, it supported the Protestant ministers, the Puritan ministers. In Virginia, you paid the tax. It paid the Anglican priest salaries. Church and state were not separate until the American Revolution. Then there became a separation, so you wouldn't be taxed to support churches. Churches had to operate on alms, on giving, you know? So here, this is the edge of the frontier. We're far away from those, the East Coast. Here we could exercise religious freedom. And so here Protestants actually helped build our church for the Catholics. In fact, they probably, some significant financial and physical, and it's noted in our history. It was amazing. Talking about something new. That was new in history, where we cooperated rather than fought each other. Now, obviously, it kind of went backwards on that, but a bit originally. And why would they want the Catholics here? You have to say, well, why would they want to support the Catholics? Because we brought education. Flagey spoke 3 languages. The priests brought education. And we needed that in the frontier. Unless you want lawlessness and chaos. So they were supported. So it's just amazing. You come up here in the edge of, all these cabins and stuff like that. And here's this brick building that I think is close to like the second largest building in America when it is built. The Capitol was bigger than this building. Can you imagine that? That this building would be very close to being the second largest structure in America, and it's Catholic. Of course, it does have the 10 Commandments on the outside, which covers all the Protestant, all the biblical religions, right? We are Christian. See these commandments? We're Christian. We're Judeo-Christian. But I think it would just have blown your mind to have, it's like in Rome, you go in the Roman Forum. If you weren't impressed before you got there, you would be definitely impressed with the Roman Forum, with the Colosseum. Oh, this is very impressive. Versailles had its walls of mirrors, like this mirrors that were brand new in the 1400s. And you had this wall of mirrors. It was like nothing you had ever seen before. If you didn't bow down before Louis XIV, the guillotine was an appropriate exit strategy. All right, there you go. All right, that's some of the things that just impressed me about the cathedral here and our church and the context in it, and just amazing at the work and dedication that has continued to make it happen. By the way, we are 1/10 of Christian history right here. 2,000 years of Christianity, 200 years, we're a tithe of the history of the Roman Catholic Church and Christianity. a good down payment, don't you think?
Yes, I am amazed at Bishop Flachet.